I grew up in Rochester, New York, with a big woods in the back of our house. And going out into those woods and going out into the woods in general was always something important to me. Growing up, I was a Boy Scout. I went to Outward Bound when I was 16. And really, I chose to come to Santa Barbara back in 1985, in part because I knew it was a very beautiful place. For the first many years, probably 20 years that I lived in Santa Barbara, I would come out hiking in the canyons occasionally. And I always loved it, but it was very much an occasional thing that I would do for a few hours. About 10 years ago, when Marion and I were in our early 50s, we took a 3-week backpacking trip in the Sierras and hiked the entire John Muir Trail. And I came back from that experience realizing that, in fact, spending time in the wilderness, in the woods, in the outdoors, hiking, was actually as important to me as my relationship with Judaism. I became a rabbi because I wanted to go deep into my Jewish identity and my Jewish heritage. And so about 10 years ago, I decided that I wanted to go as deeply as I could into the experience of hiking, camping, backpacking, and for myself, and also to bring the children of the temple out into the outdoors and into these canyons as often as possible. One of the most powerful stories in the Torah is the story of the binding of Isaac, in which God tells Abraham to take his son Isaac and to offer him up as a sacrifice on the top of the mountain. And that story has a long silence in the middle of it. Abraham and Isaac and the two young men walk for 3 days, and we're not told anything. So there's 3 days of silence. And then at the end of the 3 days, it says, Vayisa Avraham et einav, vayar et hamakom merachok. At the end of 3 days, Abraham lifted up his eyes and saw the place from afar. And that verse often comes to me as I'm walking. First of all, because I spend a lot of the time looking at the trail to make sure that I don't trip, to make sure that I don't fall off the trail. And then a moment comes where I lift my eyes and see the place, whatever that place is, see the place where I am. And sometimes it's a mountaintop, and I'll look up and I'll see the mountain and imagine that I'm Abraham in that story, seeing the place from afar. So I moved to Santa Barbara in 1985, and for a long, long time, I knew I was living in a beautiful place, but I felt absolutely like a transplant. I was a transplant from back east, and it took over 20 years for me to begin to feel more like this was home. And it was really when I started hiking and getting to know the trails and getting to know the land and the different canyons. Rattlesnake Canyon, Cold Spring Canyon, San Isidro Canyon, Romero Canyon, and also the flowers and the trees and the names of the flowers, the woolly blue curls and the climbing penstemon and the bush poppies, and I mean there's so many, but getting to know them and beginning to feel like they were familiar. It turned out that came to make me feel like this was my home in a way that I had never felt before. But one of the incredible things about hiking in Santa Barbara, especially hiking over the years, is that every once in a while we have a wildfire that burns through the area and turns the entire mountainside black, and it looks as though the whole thing is dead and over and will never live again. And then slowly, life returns, with water, with rain, and time, and eventually the mountains become green again. And you still have, as here, the reminder of the death and the destruction that came during the fire, but it's mingled with the new life. And for me, that's always been a metaphor, powerful metaphor, for rebirth on many different levels. Rebirth for a human being, but also a rebirth for us Jews. And especially after the huge firestorm of the Holocaust that wiped out over a third of our people. And yet here we are and are coming back to life. And that's what that's what comes to my mind when I see these mountainsides, which were black and burned, and now are returning to life. Most of the time when I'm hiking on my day off, I like to go off and hike alone. And while I'm hiking alone for, it could be 6 or 7 hours, I use that time in a number of different ways. Sometimes I use it to just sort of go over in my mind things that are happening at work or in my life that I want to work through, and so I'll think about those, a problem or a challenge that I'm facing. Sometimes I like to take the time to just look closely at the nature around me, the trees and the rocks and the flowers. Sometimes I use the time to go back in my memory and just review some moment in my life or moments or times in my life. Sometimes I like to sing to myself out loud, and sometimes I like to just dream and go off in a reverie and maybe even get to a place of not thinking about anything at all. And all of those ways of using the time alone out on the trail are deeply nourishing for me. And when I was in my late 40s, I had more or less decided that I was going to age gracefully and make my way into middle age and aging, and accept whatever that meant, and not worry about the fact that my body was becoming older and older. And it was in my early 50s, when I was about 53, that Marion and I first did a big backpacking trip. And when we came back from that, I went to my doctor and he said, "You've just added 10 years to your life." And so I want to just share that with anybody who's out there who's thinking that they're too old to do hiking, too old to do backpacking. You have to take your time and you have to be careful, but I don't think you're ever too old to go outside and to breathe the fresh air, to get out into the wilderness and to enjoy the trees, the fresh air, the sky, the birds. If you live here in Santa Barbara, we live in one of the most beautiful places in the world, and I encourage you to go out there and experience it for yourself.